Welcome tonight. Tonight's Tuesday night, the second of a six-part, maybe more, lecture series. The name of the series that I'm doing this June is Jews and War, Calculations, Miscalculations, and Catastrophes. Tonight is the second lecture entitled The Ceaseless Limited Wars of Early Modern Europe and the Jews. So let me begin by saying that, picking up for what we did last time, for about 1,000 years, which is a long time, the Jews took a break from war and military affairs. By that I mean they had no power, no political or cultural power, I say. The Jews were passive bystanders, while European Christians and Muslims constantly warred against each other for their own reasons. Didn't involve the Jews. The Crusades, for example, is not a Jewish thing, right? Basic to the Jews' position in law in those days was, as I've always said, to be of service and on sufferance, in the words of Shylock. The Jews, wherever they were, a tiny, helpless minority. Military action was not in the cards. They actually had to leverage their helplessness in order to gain tolerance to be able to live in Christian or Muslim societies, which theologically, by definition, are hostile to Jews and Judaism. Therefore, they're not involved in any wars. The only reason the Jews are allowed to live anywhere in the Middle Ages is if they're perceived as being of service, helping the economy, and on sufferance, which means you're really here on my total toleration, and you're helpless. Anytime I want to, I can kick you out. And it happened over and over again. The Jews were expelled perfectly legally from one place after another over the course of the Middle Ages. The basic Jewish survival strategy, obviously then, was to be zero security threat through cultural renunciation of military force. So Rashi, Tosas, the rabbi, they have nothing to do with the fighting, with the military. Now there is exceptions. There are always exceptions. But exceptions prove the rule. Obviously, the most remarkable exception to what I just said in the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages would be the famous and remarkable Shmuel HaNagid. But that was unique. So here we're dealing with somebody who, as you can see, was a big rabbi, one of the biggest Rishonim, a big Talmudist, Rosh Hashiva, also a master poet, one of the great poets in the golden age of Jews in Spain, also a prime minister of an Arab country, also the head of the CIA and the FBI, and I kid you not, and also Secretary of Defense, no, I'm not finished, and Commander-in-Chief of the Arab armies, which fought other Arab armies in the internecine wars of 11th century Spain. So he was, among other things, the Commander-in-Chief of the Arab army of Granada, and if I remember correctly, he had like 40 battles, and he won them all. So he's one of those rare generals that didn't lose. And being a master poet, we have a lot of war poems. Look at what you have in front of you, even if you can just read the English. Hasusim yurtzun gam yeshubun kitsifonim netushim memoro. The horses, he's describing a battle, lunge back and forth like vipers out of their nest. You know, you charge in a raid, you pull back, Arab style. Come in and pull out like a viper. Kila haramachim ashluchim brakim malo avira. The hurled spears were like bolts of lightning, filling the air with light. So here he is on a battlefield with arrows and spears flying all over the place, right? And he goes, Arabs pelted like raindrops. The arrows are falling down like raindrops, as if our shields were sieves. And their strung bows, as he kashishosam bakab kinachashim. Their bows were like serpents, each stinging forth a bee. Every time you shoot an arrow, it's like it hits you, you feel like you get stung by a bee. And there's all these vivid kind of descriptions. Look what he says. The swords above their heads, these are Arab armies fighting each other like glowing torches. Blood flowed on the ground like the blood of rain in the torrents of the air. And still my gallant troops scorned their lives. V'katsu ha-giborim ha-gvirim b'chayehem. They didn't mind dying in battle, preferring heroic deaths on the battlefield. So you don't usually find Rashi or the Rambam or the Ramban or the Rashi writing like this. But he was on their level, and he's most unusual. Now, that's why I find it very interesting that he wrote a poem that could have written by General Sherman. Basically, war is hell. Look what he writes. And remember, he led many armies in many battles. Krov dama b'roshol yefefiyah asher kolish l'sachek ba yaveh. War is like a beautiful girl which everyone likes to play with. V'sofo kizikena hamusa asher kol shechareh yivke v'yidveh. But in the end, war is a repulsive hag whose suitors all weep and ache. In other words, the classic literary theme, what price glory? When you go off to war, it's all glorious. When you get in the battlefield, you see it's the opposite. But this is the exception, as I said. He was unique. More typically, Spanish Jews, particularly in the second half of the Jewish experience in Spain, what we call history of Jews in Christian Spain. I'm talking about the 1200s, the 1300s, and 1400s. Got involved in the logistics side of war, not in the fighting. The business side of war. So Jews in Spain and Castile and Aragon were into the production of medieval munitions, in raising the vast sums needed by rulers, in conducting diplomacy between the warring armies. Notice the non-fighting side of war. That got Jews. These skills, which the Sephardim, the Spanish Jews, honed, earned them status in the Spanish Peninsula and Iberia and nowhere else. So you find Jewish ministers in the government or something like that, and machers at the court in a way that would be inconceivable outside of Spain. In France and Germany and England, the Jew was a pariah, you understand? But that's because Spain was a constant war of 800 years called Reconquista between the Christians and the Muslims. And the state of war produced military necessity, in which case pragmatism trumped prejudice. And this is a theme I'm going to be dealing with tonight, because they were a harbinger of the future. The Middle Ages ends around the late 15th century. Something like that. There's nothing hard and fast. These are conventions. Why do they call it the end of the Middle Ages? Well, a number of significant changes kick in. For example, you get the Renaissance and humanism. So you have the new art with Michelangelo, the humanistic writings of somebody like Erasmus. That's a huge difference. Culture changed. You get the Protestant Reformation with this Hilaria over here, with Martin Luther, who, as you know, shattered the monopoly of the Catholic Church and introduced a whole set of new ideas. You have, most importantly at all, perhaps, the technological breakthrough, the new technology, which is a remarkable part of the end of the Middle Ages. The new technology. There are many, but there aren't that many, but there's some. And two that come to mind would be the printing press, obviously. That's a cultural change. That's as big as the computer, correct? The printing press revolutionized knowledge. And the other one is gunpowder, the military technology. From 1450 on, there's a steady improvement in weapons, if you call that improvement. And so you go, as you can see in front of you, from the crossbow to the A-bomb in 500 years, right? So let's put it this way. From a technological perspective, that's an advance, even though from a moral perspective, we might not regard it as that. So life was changed, and warfare was changed by the new technologies. The weapons, as we know, were the old-fashioned muskets. These are the new technologies, of one musket ball at a time. And it didn't have great accuracy. Consequently, this required generals to mass together large numbers of men to fire volleys, which had a better chance of hitting their target if you have a whole bunch of you understand what I'm saying? You line them up, you shoot, some of them will hit the other side. That, in turn, required the training of large numbers of soldiers to fire their muskets at the same time. That, in turn, required standardizing and uniformitizing training, drill, and clothing. That's where you get the word uniform, right? You want all the soldiers to dress the same and shoot at the same time. In other words, for the first time since the Roman Empire, training and drill became an essential element of military activity, with a real attempt at professionalization, which was not the case in the Middle Ages. The country that really started this was the France of King Louis XIV, the famous Louis XIV, who was an active king for 55 years, 1660 to 1715. He really was a king since he's a baby, but it doesn't count. When he took over from 1660 on, this king wanted to rule Europe, or at least he wanted, as you can see in front of you, that France should extend to its natural frontiers. So if you look at the map that I'm pointing at you right now, you'll see the Rhine River on the right, and he said that's where France should be, up to the Rhine River, because then they have a natural boundary like the Roman Empire did, and the Germans won't be able to cross into France. Problem, it was all German territory. So he was conquering territory that didn't want him. And it was his goal and the goal of the kings of France to take over all the territory of the Rhine, which means, had they had their way, France would now include Belgium and the Rhineland, in addition to Alsace-Lorraine, be quite big. Now, this was his plan to do this by aggressive wars. France had the biggest population at the time. You won't believe this. France had a bigger population than Russia. And Louis XIV had two famous ministers who were ruthlessly mercantilist, Colbert and Louvois. You see in front of you Colbert, who is, as you see, is like the Alexander Hamilton. To be perfectly honest, Alexander Hamilton was a fan of Colbert, and he copied his economic policies. Centralization, encouraging and manufacturing, the building up of what you and I today would call a military-industrial complex, by the standards of 500 years ago. That's one. And then the other one was the Marquis de Louvois, very famous war minister, Secretary of Defense, as you call it today, who was a master organizer, and he standardized the army, and he raised an army of 400,000 men. No one had anything like that at that time. And he built up the new fortification system, Vauban. When they built Fort McHenry in America, they brought a French guy over to design the fort. The French were at the head of military technology at that time. Now, as the 16th and 17th centuries proceeded, all the other armies imitated the French. They had to. And slowly but surely, all the armies became more organized and standardized with common uniforms, common rifles, artillery, etc. Armies grew in size and in complexity of organization, with supplies of food, fodder, in other words, food for the animals, clothing, weapons, and ammo, all becoming an absolute necessity. Indeed, military strategy in those centuries very often revolved around bases and sources of supply. You understand? The whole thing was around the base and source of supply. 17th and 18th century warfare is rather distinguished by the concept of what they used to call war of maneuver, in which case you defeat an enemy army without fighting a battle, if you can pull it off. Or at least you frustrate the enemy army's attempt to get your land without fighting a battle, if you can pull it off, by cutting them off from their sources of supply or making them exhaust their supply. Many examples in military history where supply plays a key role. For example, just off the top of my head, I realize just off the top of my head, in the War of the Austrian Succession in 1744, Frederick the Great, with the Great Prussian Army, invaded Bohemia, which was part of Austria-Hungary, and the General Traun, the Austrian general, simply kept away from him, wouldn't let him fight a battle, and made sure that he was always not within range of Frederick the Great. And the Prussian army ran out of ammunition, ran out of supplies, and had to retreat. That's all. Simple as that, without fighting a battle. In fact, Frederick the Great later on said, "This is my Rebbe. Traun was my presenter in military art." And if you know anything at all about the Civil War, which you probably don't, you'll know there's something called the Tullahoma Campaign in 1863, when the Union General Rosecrans, who started out in Kentucky over there, and the Confederates occupied central and western and eastern Tennessee, and Lincoln wanted that cleaned out, and this General Rosecrans did a maneuver. Notice he came down around where the Confederates were, and then moved all the way around them through certain mountain passes, and threatened to cut off their supplies, and the Confederates then had to retreat without fighting a battle. And they pulled back all the way to Chattanooga, and then he did it again. He went around Chattanooga and cut them off from their base of supply, and then without fighting a battle, they had to retreat and pull out of Chattanooga. Then stuff happened, but the campaign itself was brilliantly successful, and General Rosecrans was angry because Abraham Lincoln didn't give him a mazel tov, and it's a famous letter he wrote to Stanton. He said, "Why? Because nobody died? Therefore it's not a glorious battle? I beat these guys, forced them out without fighting." You understand? That's why you find that sometimes great generals consider it necessary to destroy the economy and the farms and kill the crops and the animals in certain areas in order to cut the supplies off from the other side. Right again, off the top of my head, the Duke of Marlborough has the devastation of Bavaria when he's fighting the French. We'll talk about that next time. The famous English general, and Bavaria's on the side of the French, and so he simply takes the army in and burns down all the farms. And he's nothing personal. I just have to deny the French any food, and it worked. If you're American, you may remember General Sheridan was told by General Grant, "Go and burn down the whole Shenandoah Valley, so Robert E. Lee won't have supplies," and that's what they did, right? And the Grant said, "I wanted that a bird should fly through and have to bring his own provisions." In World War II, Patton was stopped because he ran out of supplies. The U.S. Army landed in D-Day. By late July, they were pushing the Germans back. They busted through the German lines. Germans were in total retreat. And Patton says, "Give me enough supplies, I can go right now to Berlin," which could very well have been true. And the war could have ended in late 44,
But he outran the supply trucks, and he just had to stop till the supplies caught up, food, ammo, things like that. And meanwhile, the Germans had time to retreat and regroup and form the defensive lines, and the war never had to go on for another 6-8 months. The Japanese in World War II lost for among reasons because when they thought about Pearl Harbor, it never occurred to them that the United States Navy would perform this logistical miracle. And as you see on the left hand, there's a famous book, Conquering Tide by Toll, who describes this very well. I recommend that book if you're into that stuff. If you look at the map on the right, all the way across the Pacific, just imagine a line of thousands of ships carrying supplies continually from the U.S. to the fighting forces. Not only ammo, toothpaste, Coca-Cola, food, oil, you name it. And who can do that? But the Americans showed in World War II they were the masters of logistics. So the bottom line is that we see supplies are the untold story you don't see about them in movies. Supplies and logistics on a large scale require a first-class businessman, some with amazing organizational skills. Let me explain. It's simple. Let's say, for example, in the 18th century, you have an army of 40,000 soldiers. Not so big. 40,000 soldiers. Okay, Rabosai, that's 120,000 meals a day. Here in the Corona time, TA is giving out meals, officials giving out meals. 120,000 meals a day, 3 times 40. And that's not counting the animals. You got to feed them oats and stuff. The cavalry horses and the pack animals. So you got to come up with 150,000 meals a day. That's over 1 million meals a week. Are you able to supply week after week 1 million meals a week? That's for an army of 40,000. And many armies were a lot larger. And this was before you had trains and mechanized transport. How is this done? Other than France, the European countries, including the Turkish Empire, did not have the bureaucratic apparatus to handle these supplies. And even if they had such bureaucracies, all the bureaucrats do is turn to the private sector. That's what they did in this country in World War II. Bureaucrats go to private industry and they run up the big defense contracts. The only one that doesn't have a private sector would be if you're Stalin in World War II. There is no private sector. So the Soviet state was a war economy sui generis. There's Stalin, and the guys around him look like a bunch of boobs. Aren't. The guy in the funny suit on Stalin's right, Malenkov, and Khrushchev on the left, these guys ran the economy. You understand? They made sure everybody in Russia ate, maybe they ate a little, that the army had plenty to eat, or enough to eat, that they had the ammo, the tanks, all this stuff. It's an economic marvel. But everybody else has a private sector. But there was no private sector, not an adequate one in the early modern era. It wasn't an industrial complex with factories. So what do? How do you have a war? How do you have an army without a military-industrial complex? An objective necessity will produce an answer, or not. The objective necessity, therefore, in the early modern era, was for what we would call a one-man Pentagon. A businessman with extreme executive ability, a wide economic network that provided access to massive amounts of food and manufactured goods produced in little cottages. I need belts for an army. That's leather. So I get, 1,000 peasant families or whatever, or 2,000 or 3,000, and I contract with them. Each one does a belt, or 4,000, whatever. So it's that kind of organization of labor. And another network that could transport everything to the desired destination on specified dates for 1 million meals a week. In other words, the skills that today would make somebody the successful CEO of a major corporation. Such persons are always hard to find, and were even more rare in the early modern era. The scarcity of such individuals, coupled with the absolute military requirements of surviving in the European jungle of those centuries, when everybody's at war with each other all the time, led the rulers of Europe and the generals to put aside the passionate anti-Semitism and turn to Jews again and again. It all started, predictably, with what we know is the very first necessity of war. Here is the famous Austrian commander Montecuccoli. Sounds funny to you, but he was a famous general. And he said famously, for war you need 3 things: Geld, Geld, and Geld. Right? That's number 1. And so where do you get that? Okay? Where do you get that? Kings who wage wars or maintain large armies need lots of money. Now how does one get that kind of Geld? Well, one way is through taxes. But this is not so simple. because the king had to. They were not absolute monarchs the way people think. They had to deal with what's called the estate, the nobles, the clergy, the middle class, and all that, who didn't want to pay large taxes usually. You could have mercantilist economics, taxes on imports, exports, commerce, that sort of thing. And the countries of Europe did pursue that policy, especially France. But how much does it bring in? Then you're borrowing from your big banks with big interest. The banks of Amsterdam, for example, were famous for having a lot of bucks. But, obviously they charge according to the risk. And then you got Jews. Successful Jews who knew how to broker big deals in terms of government loans, which means pooling funds from other Jews elsewhere. It's a kind of alternative financial system, you get it? These Jews, the ones I'm talking about, could amass large funds. But how reliable was the king's going to pay? That's the risk, baby. That's the risk. So the interest and everything else is calculated into that. Already in the 16th century, back in the 1500s, the most famous Jew in Germany at that time, Joseph of Rosheim, who was the Jewish representative in front of all the Goyish authorities. If you're my age, you'll remember the famous 2-volume teenage book by Marcus Lehman called Joseph of Rosheim. But you probably know what he's talking about. This is a very famous Jew in the 1500s, a remarkable person, who was this businessman and a rabbi. And he's the guy who dealt on behalf of the Jews with the Goyish governments, especially the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was also the king of Spain. In Spain there was Inquisition, in Germany there wasn't. And Jews had a very hard time in the 1500s. But I can tell you right this, Joseph of Rosheim was able to be of service to the armies of the Emperor Charles V in the wars of religion that were flourishing in the 1500s between the Catholics and the Protestants. And through his help, he was able to extract better treatment for German Jews as a reward. So there you have a case where Jews said, listen, we're doing you a lot of favors, why don't you ease up on the gezeras a little bit? And we know even though Charles V hated the Jews, but he was pragmatic. And this is especially, Charles could not help but be grateful when Joseph, you don't know the history of Charles V obviously, but in the end of his life they had what he called the First War of the Schmalkaldic League, I kid you not, and the Second War of the Schmalkaldic League, and during the Second War of the Schmalkaldic League there was a plot by Maurice of Saxony to invade the Tyrol and to kidnap the emperor, and there's a guy in Samaisa connected with this, and Joseph warned him. So basically he saved his bacon, Now, these are facts. The role of the Jews as suppliers of money and food and supplies, to be a food and supply they call a commissary. You've heard that, like nowadays they'll say, this caterer has a commissary. But the technical term, commissary, refers to somebody who supplies, who provides food and supplies, things like that to somebody. In this case, army. The role of Jews as suppliers of money and food and supplies as commissaries increased dramatically during the 30 Years' War. Here you have a map of a war that lasted 30 years, obviously. And it was in Germany fought. And you see those lines a little bit. And Germany was invaded by Sweden. And that's what you see over there. And by the French. And by the Catholics versus the Protestants. And sometimes the Catholics won. And sometimes the Protestants won. And there were other armies in there. And what they all had in common, they killed Germans by the zillions. And when the war was over, the Catholic Church had to give a heter for a while for bigamy, polygamy. That's how many men were killed. So during this, you had armies constantly fighting for 30 years all over the place. An army needs food. An army needs supplies. An army needs weapon. You also need what we call today a canteen, a PX, the equivalent in those days. And this is something the Jews got into, because the Jews are not Catholic or Protestant, We have one of the famous chroniclers from that time, Johann Moshe Brush, who was a famous person in Germany, who famously said, because he was in the 30 Years' War, all Jews are commissaries, all commissaries are Jews. Because whenever you go into battle, you see the Protestant army, you see the Catholic army, you see the Swedish army, you see the French army, you see the Spanish army, and Jews, right? They're there before the battle starts, they're there when the battle's over. If a soldier killed an enemy and took a diamond ring, the Jewish guys did it to buy it off him, turn in the money. I kid you not. They're there to provide the necessities and also the luxuries. You want to buy ice cream and all the rest of it. So all commissaries are Jews, all Jews are commissaries. There were many of these Jewish commissaries as the 17th century proceeded. This is a whole series by itself, by the way. I could go in great lengths. Tonight, I'm going to concentrate on 3 or 4, actually I only have time for 2, of the most famous of these commentaries in order to make a point. V'od chazon l'moed. I hope to do more justice to this in a part 2. The first of the 3 famous ones, or 2 tonight, is Samuel Oppenheimer, Shmuel Oppenheimer, who lived, as you see, right through the 1600s. He's from Heidelberg in western Germany, southern Germany, near the Rhine. And he's a from guy. He was very good in business, obviously, and he became of help to the local German ruler. There were like 50, 60, 70 little German states, some of them the size of a postage stamp, some of them much larger. And he was, I think, the elector of the Palatine, one of the German princes. And he got into business supplying the court and all the rest of it. And he got a good reputation. In business, all your reputation. Will you fill the contract? Will you do it on time and under budget, under scale, and all that? Now, that means for the first 43 years of his life, he was a successful Jewish businessman in Western Germany. But then he was called to Austria. Here we're dealing with what we call today the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire. It wasn't Austria at that time. If you look over there in the purple colors, I guess, you'll see it's not even designated, but in the middle, can I point to this or not?
I have over there, look.
Yeah, okay, great.
No, nobody can see it, but I have the mouse on it.
So here, okay, great. Where the mouse is now, we call the Crown of Bohemia and Austria and all that. This is ruled by the Habsburg family, which is called the House of Austria. This is called the Austrian Empire. It's not the Austrian people. And this were the Holy Roman Emperors, and they were trying to hold on to their territory and expand it. And Austria fought many wars in the 1600s continuously against neighboring powers who were trying to take their land away. Now, the ruler of Austria for 50 years was the Holy Roman Emperor, because the Holy Roman Emperor was another title of the ruler of Austria, was Leopold I, who was not a nice guy in general. He was certainly not friendly to the Jews. Matter of fact, when he married his first wife, she was Spanish and ugly. Take a look at her. And anti-Semitic. And she said, and they had a child who died in childbirth, and she says, it's because you have Jews here. And she nagged him, and he kicked the Jews out of Vienna, even though it hurt his economy. That was in 1670. And Shalom al Yisrael. Well, guess what? 3 years later, the European politics was such that they were attacked by the French. He got into a big war against King Louis XIV, the huge king of France. At that time, necessity kicked in, because all of a sudden, you're fighting a major European army, and if you lose, you're going to lose your throne. You're going to take over your country. So what do? Now, the Austrian army, the Imperial Army they call it, was fighting the French, and they had a good general, but they couldn't contend against the French forces because the supply system was dysfunctional, as the General Montecuccoli, as you see over here, who was a great general, was always complaining, he said, I can't do nothing. If the weapons don't come, if the supplies don't come, if the food doesn't come, if the soldiers don't have shoes, if they don't have cannonballs, they can't do it. And so the Austrian government officials in the treasury and the defense said, we hate to say it, but we hate to say it because we hate Jews. We're very bitter Catholics. We hate the Jews, but we need this Jewish guy Oppenheimer. We heard he's honest, and most important, he's efficient. Okay? When he says he'll deliver, he'll deliver. And this is what the army needs more than anything else. And it's a case of necessity overcoming prejudice. Leopold the Emperor reluctantly concurred. And from then on, during his many wars, the Austrian armies, the imperial armies, were totally run on the supply side and so forth, and the finance side by Jews. All of his reign, the Emperor Leopold will have cognitive dissonance towards Shmuel Oppenheimer. He's a from Jew. I hate him. On the other hand, I have to admit that he's the best. It pains me to admit that he's far and above any Christian guy. It pains me to admit that he's never cheated me or caused me any loss. I have to say, the guy's not Jewish, but he's first rate. Why can't we find a Catholic? But we can't. That's how he thought. Okay? Now, as a result, the imperial government, the Austrian government, stiffed Samuel repeatedly. He raised big money for him and he didn't get paid. He spent a lot of money. They gave him promissory notes that weren't worth anything. And he continued to be the commissary. I don't know why. Why would you deal with that? But maybe we can only speculate. Maybe he felt thrilled to be at the top of the politics, but because he made money other ways also. But to do what he did was just extraordinary, as you'll see in a minute. In the 1680s and 1690s, Austria, the Habsburgs, got involved in a two-front war, okay, with dramatic consequences. So if you look at the map in front of you, you see the Holy Roman Empire, right? And where the cursor is. And on the left side is France, and the right side is the Ottoman Empire. And the Austrians are attacked on both sides, and are fighting on both sides. So mainly they got involved in over their head. In 1683 came a very famous event in European history, the Ottoman-Turkish invasion of Austria and the siege of Vienna. Okay? So the Turks came with an army of 300,000 men. The Austrians had like 30,000. The city of Vienna was under siege and being attacked by the Turks. If the Turks would have broken through, maybe they would come to take over the rest of Europe. Maybe everybody would be Muslim today. It's a famous event. At the last minute, very dramatically, here, let's show the movie. Okay. Very dramatically, the Ottoman commander, the Kara Mustafa, the vizier, saw a Polish army on a hill nearby and came and surprise attacked them and won. So this is called the famous relief of Vienna by Jan Sobieski, the Polish king, who achieved international fame as a result of this. Sobieski, who was a Polish king, was good to the Jews, I would point out, had fought the Turks many times and learned how to beat them. He knew their tactics, and he put his artillery on a hill where nobody could see, and had this priest over there. And if you see in a second, the Polish army lined up, and they made basically, I would say, the most famous cavalry charge of the modern times. All right, if you'll, I won't hold you to watch the whole movie over here, which is a shame. But if you give it another minute, you'll see that they're called the Winged Hussars. The Polish specialized in these lance charges with the cavalry. They used to wear wings and things like that. There's the Polish army, and they busted the Turks. Now, let's move on. They can watch this separate. By the way, Poland recently made this movie. Poland, because they're very proud of this, and they say we stopped the Muslims. You understand? Now, as a result, the Turks, who had always won, were beaten and ran away, but they still fought like tigers. They're now proceeded for the next 15 years the imperialist counteroffensive. In other words, the Emperor Leopold got German princes and others to raise armies and go fight for the reconquest of Hungary, because as you can sort of see in your map over there, this whole area of Hungary, which was much larger than Hungary today, it's like Hungary plus Romania, or a lot of it, Transylvania and stuff, and Slovakia. This Hungary was ruled by the Turks, and the Austrians and their allies undertook this long series of wars, which is basically involved with what they call the Christian reconquest of Hungary, the Reconquista, and the Austrian armies were led by two very famous generals, two brilliant first cousins, Prince Louis of Baden and Prince Eugene of Savoy. You see, called the Smashers of the Turks. They're actually very famous in history, and you'll see it's a Jewish angle. These two generals, who were young guys, right, beat the Turks again and again in long, hard battles, and they are the two biggest Hasidim of Reb Shmuel Oppenheimer. Why? Because he delivers. Okay? He delivers. The armies constantly needed supplies, food, weapons, and all the rest of it. And he sent fleets of ships down the Danube. I'll read you something in a minute. Plus, in addition, Shmuel Oppenheimer was a smart guy. When these guys first came to Vienna, they were broke. And he lent them a lot of money. He could tell that they're going places because they were foreign-born nobodies. And when they reached the pinnacle of success, they remembered who had been their friend in tough times. Indeed, Prince Eugene, I can't emphasize what a famous general he is in Europe, Eugene of Savoy, whose conquests extended into the Balkans. He conquered Belgrade, Sarajevo, and who knows what, is supposed to have made a policy during his wars. Whenever he came across Hebrew-looking stuff, instead of burning it, he would put it away and send them to Shmuel Oppenheimer. And these included rare Sfarim and Kisvei Yad manuscripts, which later on ended. It's a long story. His nephew, who's let's go to the next one, is the famous Rav Dobbin Oppenheimer of Prague. was a big, rich rabbi in the 1700s, and he got all these books and manuscripts, and he added on to them. And here you see a title of a book that just came out called Prince of the Press by some professor in New York who obviously wrote a dissertation on this very famous collection of 4,500 farm and 1,000 manuscripts that ended up, after a whole series of adventures, in Oxford in the Bodleian Library, and it's still very famous, used by scholars today. Old and rare editions, unique editions of many things. And if the story is true, then all these come from Prince Eugene of Savoy, the Catholic commander for Shmuel Oppenheimer. Now, his star rose higher and higher, and sure enough, like you read in the Pirkei story, the Prime Minister of Austria, Cardinal Kolonich, who had formerly been a soldier himself, he hates the fact that a Jew has so much power and is so efficient. He says, this is a chill of Christianity, and we got to do something about it. And the emperor said, you're right. Get me somebody. And he said, I'll get you the Bishop of Würzburg. But you know what happens? Every time they put this guy in charge, it messed up. They were corrupt. They didn't deliver on time. And the generals were saying, what'd you get rid of the Jew for, And he said, well, it's a chill of Christianity. He said, the heck with that, we got to win. And this is the politics of that time. So when he screwed up, obviously Rav Shmuel Oppenheimer was recalled. No one can match his amazing abilities and international networking skills. How's a guy like this do it? Let me say that out loud, and then I'll read you. If I'm Shmuel Oppenheimer, and I have an army of 50,000 men on the Rhine, and I need, like you say, 1 million meals a day, including animal stuff, I got to get in touch with other Jews elsewhere in Germany where they're growing grain, and outside of Germany like Poland and Ukraine, where they have vast fields of grain. And I got to say, how much grain you got out there, guys? And so, oh, we got a Velt. Well, I'll buy it all. Before the season is over, before it's harvested, I'll buy it all. And what's the price? We agree on the price. And then you got to get other Jews, Shmerel and Beryl and Yankel, and say like this: how do we haul, 10 million pounds, 20 million pounds of grain to the Rhine, all the way across Europe? So they open the map, and they got to say, well, you got to get it to this river, and they got to organize a caravan of so and so many. No, it's logistic. How many wagons does it take? How many horses are we going to need to do the wagons? How much fodder are we going to need to provide for the horses to schlep the wagons? Like, hi, God, you have to bring the grain by August 10th to this place on the Rhine, or in Hungary, or someplace like that. No, the level of organization, unbelievable. The amount of calculations, unbelievable. Take a look. Here's a famous description from the Selma Stern book, where she wrote about this. This is just a typical time at Shmuel Oppenheimer. There now followed a period of intense activity. Oppenheimer was able to deliver immediately after the signing of the contract with the Austrians 80,000 hundredweights of flour to the garrison at Linz, but had to work day and night to obtain as great a quantity of oats as possible so the cavalry would not be endangered by no food. When after the liberation of Vienna, the Austrian imperial troops began to pursue the fleeing Turks, Oppenheimer arranged to have hand grenades, gunpowder, pistols, and carbines sent on ships and rafts down the Danube River and by means of wagons and horses on the roads. And you can imagine what the roads were like at that time. At the same time, he secured rafts to move troops from the Empire, transported an army from Hungary to Krakow, an army, transferred cavalry regiments from Braunschweig to Bohemia, these are long distances, and supplied the fortresses in Hungary, Albania, Transylvania, Serbia. You sit next to this guy in Shul, you have no idea what he's running, right? Don't change it. His chief problems were besieged Ofen, Vienna, where the army had to be supplied with provisions, munition, clothing, tobacco, linen, brandy, and newly conquered Belgrade, where he sent 100 ships, hospital and camp equipment, and material for shipbuilding down the Danube. Talk to me about the organization that's required to put all this together. Let's go. When in 1688, Louis XIV began the War of the Palatinate, Oppenheimer, the Jewish guy, undertook to supply the soldiers on the Rhine, on the Main River, and in the Danube. At the same time, he was suggesting the construction of a Danubian fleet. He was fortifying the fortress of Philipsburg, which was attacked eventually and is still being threatened by the French. Nothing escaped his observation. He followed political maneuvers, the formation and dissolution of coalitions, kept himself informed. This is before CNN. You understand? There were no newspapers. How do you organize an efficient, intelligent system that keeps you up to date with what's happening in Europe? You have to have first-class spy network. You understand? What does he have? He watched with close interest the military movements of generals and calmly calculated the economic difficulties of the government. He drove his numerous agents, business friends, and correspondents throughout Europe, his son and his employees, to ever greater efforts, whether he was ordering gunpowder and cloth from Holland, wool and saltpeter from Bohemia, arms and munitions from Carinthia, spices from Hamburg, grain from Bamberg. He appeared as one driven to restless activity, but also as one who refused to acknowledge defeat and for whom no obstacles were insurmountable. His ships were often wrecked. His goods were confiscated or damaged. His transports were delayed. Shipments of money were lost. His funds were depleted. His creditors pressed and even threatened him, and yet he never lost courage. He was attacked and reviled. Malicious, unscrupulous, impassioned people, as he describes them, tried to harm him. His home was plundered. His business papers destroyed. His employees, his son himself, spent months in prison because the government imprisoned him every once in a while. His goods were disapproved. His accounts were checked. Payments were withheld from him. Yet his will was never broken. If anything, these difficulties served only to strengthen his determination. And that's a small piece of who the guy was. So it's actually quite remarkable. He wasn't fighting physically, but he's running the war, the supply side. And I'll tell you again, he's the guy you see in Shul. He's a rich guy, yeah. He's the guy you see in Shul. You have no conception of what's going through his mind when he's davening Baruch when he's doing Shemoneh Esrei. I mean, my goodness. Now, therefore, nobody can match this. And the zenith of his efforts was when his very good friend Prince Eugene, let's go to the next one. Right. The zenith of his efforts came in 1697 when Prince Eugene of Savoy won his greatest victory. You see in front of you what they call the Battle of Zenta. It's very famous. That's Eugene. Obviously a dramatization. And they caught the Turks with their pants down. They were crossing a bridge and they weren't ready for attack. And Eugene sent the army right in. He said, we're going to go right now, en avant, on the advance. And they just started firing. They just took out the thing, started firing at the Turks. And the Sultan of Turkey was on the bridge, and he almost got killed. And basically the Turks were totally busted. And as a result of this, Turks had surrendered. This battle cost the Turks Hungary. You understand? It was this battle that made that Hungary would be a Christian country, as it is. The Hungarians know it. That's why they're all against the Muslim immigration and that sort of thing. They're very illiberal on this. They said, we went through this once already. That's the Sultan of Turkey. And his army was destroyed in front of his eyes. All those bullets you see from the Austrians, all the horses that supplying the cavalry, all that stuff, the swords, everything except the fighting, where there's Eugene shooting a pistol, all supplied by Shmuel Oppenheimer. That's my point, okay? All of it. Because nobody else could get this stuff there in time. All of it. So without that, without the means of war, you wouldn't have all these dramatic things. Now, nobody ever knows that. And so what you do is you look at this. This is what they make movies out of. Errol Flynn. They show the dramatic stuff. And by the way, no question about it. There certainly was dramatic. And Eugene Savoy was a hero. And now all that there's no question about it. But you couldn't do it if you didn't have the wherewithal. And that's my point. Okay? Now, as a result, Hungary was liberated from the Turks, if you want to call it that, with Jewish money and military supplies. I think it's just funny. Because later on, the Jews in Hungary were a very important element in the economy, dominated parts of the economy. The gods of Hungary became a country liberated from the Turks by Jewish money. You want to be down to it. The Hungarians know it, but they don't like to talk about it. What did he get in return? He never got really paid well. So he got trinkets. He had the right to have his Gesindel, his mob, live with him. So basically, no Jew was allowed in Vienna. Okay, Shmuel and Upper can live in Vienna. But Shmuel and Upper said, yes, I got a family, I have a wife and children. All right, the wife and children live in Vienna. I need a rabbi to run the services. All right, can't have a rabbi. I need a chazan to run the service. Okay, you have a chazan. I need a shaykh to run the service. You need a shaykh. You see what I'm saying? For all this kind of shtick, he got a lot of people the right to live in Vienna, where it was easier to make a living. So that's one thing. The emperor gives him the title Chief Rabbi of Hungary. Yeah, you just wiped out Hungary, now you make him Chief Rabbi. Big deal. There was, by the way, a big Jewish community in Buda. Not in Budapest, but Buda. And when the Austrian imperialists took it over, they killed all the Jews because it was in the frenzy of a battle. This I spoke about not long ago in the podcast. This is the Chacham Tzvi, you understand? Who was the rabbi in Buda. And an Austrian cannonball landed in his Shabbos table, killed his wife and children in front of his eyes. And he himself was taken as a prisoner, as a slave. But Shmuel Oppenheimer brought him out. You understand? So it's a strange series of events we're dealing with over here. When Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, not the Yehuda Chassid of the Sefer Chassidim, but this proto-Zionist, organized 1,000 Jews to go and try to make a big aliyah in Israel in 1700. He had to go from Poland, where he rounded up his 1,000 followers, and somehow or other get to Israel, which means he had to go through the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Shmuel and Oppenheimer got him special passports, and they could go down the Danube on boats. So he was able to do a thing like that. And finally, this book you see in front of you is from Johann Andreas Eisenmenger, a very famous writer, who wrote a book called Anti-Jewish. What the real secrets of the Jews, what Jews really think of us. And he had faked everybody out and pretended to be a Christian who was interested in being Megayer. And he learned up a storm in the yeshiva. And in his book, he has a German and translations. You won't believe it. Not only of bad things as he sees it from the Bible and the Talmud, he's got the Marsha, the Shita Mekubetzes, the Rajba. The guy knows how to learn. It's a very, very interesting book, and it's been translated in many languages. Well, they didn't want this book published in 1700 because it caused big anti-Semitism. And Shmuel Oppenheimer paid off the emperor to forbid the publication of the book, although the guy got around it in another way. But that, these little favors you could get. That's all. When he tries to collect the money owed to him, the emperor stiffed him, and when Shmuel Oppenheimer died in 1703, the government declared it would not honor its debts to him. Okay? And naturally the business went bankrupt, went belly up. Okay? In other words, let's put it this way. You want a friend? Get a dog. As a later Austrian statesman once said, Austria will always shock the world by the depths of its ingratitude. And this is certainly demonstrated over here, because he saved them time after time, and they stiffed him. But of course, they were not only evil, but stupid, because what happens if the number one business goes belly up? It caused a depression, you understand? It shook the whole business world. The Austrian economy collapsed. But these bureaucrats were so anti-Semitic, they wouldn't see it. In spite of everything, Rabbi Shmuel's successor was ready to pick up right where he left off. That's the next guy you see over here, Samson Wertheimer, who was married to the niece by marriage of Shmuel Oppenheimer. Samson Wertheimer was an ex-yeshiva guy. Oppenheimer was just a good Jew, but he wasn't learned. This guy was a big Talmid Chacham. You understand? But like you see sometimes, guys in yeshiva, they're very good Talmid Chachamim, but they go for business. And he ended up going to Vienna when he was a young man and getting involved in the Shmuel Oppenheimer business with his military contracts. He became one of his right-hand men, and he learned the business. And he also was a business genius of the type I'm describing over here. And what can I tell you? He becomes the number one military commissary for the imperial forces for the next 20, 30 years. As a result, Jews are not allowed to live in Vienna except him, but not far from Vienna is Eisenstadt. Here, take a look at this. This is me. I'm the fatso in the front. Speaking to that's his shul. If you still go there, the Samson Wertheimer synagogue is still there because he was named by the emperor, chief rabbi of everything. And he helped the Jews in Eisenstadt, which is one of the Sheva Kehillas, if you're from there, build up. And it was a nice building and all the rest of it. And Eisenstadt was a big Malkam Torah as a result of his, patronage all through the 1700s. You have Panim Me'iras, Yodas and Eish, are big people over there because they're under the patronage of the wealthiest Jew. Now, as I said before, he was a Talmid Chacham, even a posek, you'd be surprised. Wertheimer knew how to operate more successfully than Shmuel Oppenheimer, and he avoided being stiffed. I don't know exactly how he did it, but he avoided being stiffed, and he knew how to get along with the three Gaish emperors who didn't like Jews. Here you have Leopold on the left, and Joseph I, who was his son, on the right, who died young, and then Charles VI, who really hated Jews. And in spite of that, he flourished under them, and therefore, in addition to that, he was a big Talmid Chacham. He sponsored yeshivas, he wrote Shalos and Shuvas, he gave drushes, pilpulistic stuff, the chidushim, and that's why his relative, the Chavas Yoyer, famously wrote about him, because Chavas Yoyer was written at this time. He said, "Mimos Ravashi lo nimtzu digmoso torah gdul malkam echad." That you have to go back a long time to Ravashi in the time of Gemara, find somebody who was a multi-millionaire and a world-class businessman, as I'm describing over here. I've only touched on the surface. I think you get it. You have to, if you're interested in the subject, you'll look it up on your own. And at the same time, what can I tell you? He's writing Chedushim and Lamdis, Pilpulistic Shabbos Hagadol Drushes, Shalos and Shubas, while in a carriage on his way to arrange artillery and food for the armies of Prince Eugene of Savoy and Louis of Baden on the Rhine facing the French during the War of the Spanish Succession. That needs an artist. You know, we have so many stupid paintings out there. If you have somebody who wants a Jewish art contest, that would be gewaldig. You know, you'd have to find the historical costumes, all the rest of it, because it's true. It's like Shmuel Nugget a little bit. You understand? While he's organizing the economy of the world, he's also writing Divrei Torah. It reminds a little bit of Shmuel Nugget. He was able, therefore, because he was a big shot, to get the emperor to agree that you can publish a Shas in Frankfurt in 1712. This is most unusual because usually Catholic countries, they don't let you publish the Gemara. As a result of his extraordinary skills at networking and finance, Prince Eugene of Savoy was able to lead the Austrian army to famous victories against the French. They're like the only times the Austrians beat the French in history. In the War of the Spanish Succession, this is a fascinating, colorful chapter in the history of warfare, but the hour is late. And so I'll continue this, I hope, in the next lecture. As I said before, this might turn out into a 7-part series, if I can get the sponsors for this. We've scratched the surface of the subject, but I think you'll see my basic point, which is that in the 15, 16, and 1700s particularly, the Jews are very heavily involved in wars, but not in the ways that you would imagine. Right? Not in the ways you imagine. But the Europeans cannot conduct a war with the help of these super Jews, whose networking skills and organizational skills are extraordinary, and they've turned, what's the right word? Busted lemons into lemonade. The fact that Jews are scattered everywhere, they're persecuted everywhere, means you have Jewish networking possibilities. You can deal with Jews in the head of Russia, in Poland, in Lithuania, in England, in Italy, in the Ottoman Empire, and I can get all kinds of material in a way that nobody else can get it together. And if I can put it together in the right time, in the right place, I have what you call today a government contract. And I never heard of anybody in history who got rich without a government contract of one type or another. And that's quite a statement I just made. But I leave you with that and have a good evening.